Good evening, everyone. We've got folks that are still continuing to come in, but we're going to go ahead, for the interest of time, to get started. So, thank you all again for joining us. My name is Philip Duggins. I work here in the Alumni Engagement Office here at University of Mary Washington, and we thank you for joining us for our 7th season of Mary Talks. We are very excited that you could join us, and we look forward to having you participate and be a part of our program tonight. There will be an opportunity throughout the evening for you to ask questions. The way we will do that is at the bottom of the screen. You see a Q&A button. If you click on that, that'll be the opportunity for you to actually type in your question. And then if you see a question that is of interest to you, you can upvote it, and it will rise to the top and will be more likely to be answered when we get to the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So we once again thank you for joining us. Tonight I will introduce Olivia Ruck from the class of 2022.
Thank you, Philip. Hi, everyone. I'm Libby. I graduated from UMW in the spring, and I'm currently getting my master's degree in anthropology at East Carolina University. Last year, I was a part of Dr. McMillan's Preservation in the Community class and helped to write and design the signs for the King George County Native American History and Culture Trail. The next semester, me and another student, Luca Malloy, interned with King George County to finalize the signs and develop a marketing plan for the trail. So now on to the star of the show. Dr. McMillan earned her BA in Historic Preservation from the University of Mary Washington, MA in Anthropology from East Carolina University, and PhD in Anthropology with a concentration in Historical Archaeology from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Prior to coming back to UMW, Dr. McMillan was a project archaeologist at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Dr. McMillan is the recipient of several awards, including the inaugural Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture and Jamestown Rediscovery Short-Term Fellowship in 2016 for her research into 17th century clay tobacco pipes. In 2020, she was awarded the University of Mary Washington Giving Tree Award for dedication to enhancing the quality of student life and active involvement with the student body. Dr. McMillan returned to UMW in 2017 and is currently assistant professor in the Department of Historic Preservation at the University of Mary Washington. She teaches North American archaeology, Intro to Historic Preservation, Intro to Architectural History, and public preservation classes. She has published and presented on a variety of topics ranging from early colonial clay tobacco pipes to the antebellum and Civil War landscapes. Her current teaching and scholarly research are centered around collaborations with the Potomac and Rappahannock Indian tribes, most recently in the collaboration with King George County, in the creation of King George County Native American History and Culture Trail, which will be discussed tonight. In addition to teaching historic preservation classes, Dr. McMillan is also the president of the Middle Atlantic Archaeological Conference and is a lifelong bagpipe player and the director of UMW's Eagle Pipe Band. It is now my honor to present Dr. McMillan.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you very much. Good to see you back in my old stomping grounds at East Carolina. So welcome, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I hope everyone can see that. So the King George County Native American History and Culture Trail. I'm going to discuss tonight the process of development of the class, Historic Preservation, Preservation of the Community class that I taught last fall, and talk about the kind of collaborative work that we've been doing with 2 local indigenous tribes here in the Fredericksburg region. But before we really dive in, I would like to thank my stakeholders. Mainly, I would like to thank the Rappahannock tribe of Virginia, as well as the Potomac Indian tribe of Virginia, 2 indigenous tribes here in the Fredericksburg region that we have been partnering with. I'd also like to thank Nick Miner from the King George County Department of Economic Development and Tourism, who initiated this project, who's been my partner in this for a year now, over a year now. And I'm really thankful that all these people were really gracious with their time, willing to meet multiple times, review the product several times, and spent time with our students over the past year now, working on this on this project. And we're nearly complete there. I'd also like to thank all the students who were in the class, the Preservation of the Community class. Each one of them put an extraordinary amount of work into the final products that I will be talking about tonight. They were mostly seniors, but a few juniors in that class last year. And they just kept up the whole time. As those of you who know, who work with community partnerships, and anyone who works in the real world knows, you can make yourself a schedule and you can make yourself a plan, but things will change as we move, as things get moving. And they were great, and they just kept up the whole time. And I'm really appreciative of everything that they did. And two other partners in this project, Pete Morolevich, aka Print Jazz, he's a local artist here in Fredericksburg, worked with the students to talk about design principles, and helped them think about the final designs for the signs that I'm going to talk about for the trail. And then Drew Gruber, the executive director of Civil War Trails. He's also a former classmate of mine, a UMW alum. We graduated together, went through the program together. He's now the executive director of the Civil War Trails. When I realized I was going to be making a trail, the first person I turned to was Drew Gruber. And he came in and talked with our students about best practices for trail systems and what they need to be thinking about, what makes a good heritage trail. Okay, so preservation in the community. That's the name of this class that this trail came out of. This is a relatively new course that we began developing a few years ago. Professor Christine Henry and I, we really started thinking about what can we do to be more deliberately involved in the community here in Fredericksburg. And the idea being that the class would, most of our preservation classes involve community partnership in one way or another. But usually we have kind of a concept in mind, and we look for partners to fulfill, to work with to complete a project. But this class we envision to be one in which, because we get called a lot, and people will say, I have this great archaeological site, don't you want to dig it? Or I'm a small nonprofit museum, we really need an exhibit. And so we kind of envisioned this class to be something where the community reached out to us and we could develop a class around the community needs, partnership needs, limited to the Fredericksburg region, just for logistical reasons. So the first time this class was taught was by Professor Christine Henry a few years ago, and she partnered with the John J. Wright Museum in Spotsylvania County, which was a segregated Black school, and she did an oral history project with people who had attended that school, and she created this whole project around that because they came to her and said, we would like to do this, we want these oral histories developed and taken. And so this class, as we've been thinking about it and developing it, the exact content and partners and projects and even the professor that teaches it is going to probably differ every semester. But the purpose of the class really remains the same, that historic preservation really must be a collaborative endeavor in which preservation professionals, us faculty, but also our students are budding preservation professionals. We must work in partnership with various stakeholders to preserve historic resources. And as I said, intangible with the oral histories, but it's also tangible as well. And we really need to work collaboratively with our partners to present history to the public in a responsible and meaningful way. And so the focus of this class, this last fall, was on Virginia Indian culture. And so the students really had to immerse themselves in the history to develop factual and interesting narrative science. But I would say the students were also developing skills related to collaborative and engaged community work, public interpretation of historical narratives, heritage tourism and the economic viability of historic preservation. And that's a big one I'll touch on later. And historic sign and trail design development. So these are like real skills that they can take after they graduate, and they can apply in their professions when they leave Mary Washington. And I want to really stress that this was not just like a class project. We developed a real product. The students developed a real product that is being implemented right now. So I had thought I wanted, so I proposed that I wanted to teach this class. And those of you who are not, who don't teach at the university, we have to say what classes we're going to teach like months in advance, which is fine for our basic intro classes, our lecture style classes. But some of these project classes, they, you know, I might agree to teach it in February. Well, when August rolls around, I better have a project by then. And I had thought I was going to do one thing when I agreed to do this class. And I mean, this was fall 2021. Things happened with the project I was going to do, and it fell through that summer. And I was kind of like, all right, what am I going to do with this class? I told these students we're going to be doing a community-based project. My project fell through, you know, COVID things happened, and like it just worked out perfectly. King George County, Nick Miner from King George County, from the Economic Development and Tourism Department, reached out and he said, hey, you know, we want to really boost heritage tourism in King George County. And we want to be the first place in Virginia to have a fully collaborative and realized Native American history trail. And I was like, you know, this is right up my alley. This is great. It worked out. It was perfect. And so King George County, and particularly Nick, you know, he is very interested in telling diverse stories in King George County, but he's also the head of economic development and tourism. And so part of this project was he has to make it economically viable. And the point was to bring people into King George County. And I thought this was a great project, a real world project, where sometimes, you know, us preservation professionals, we can kind of be like, we need to save everything because it needs to be saved because it's old. But the reality is we have to there has to be, a lot of times we have to justify it and we have to make it economically viable in some way. And so heritage tourism is one of these ways. And so this part of this project was not just developing these narratives and these signs, but the point was to bring people into King George County and to very specific access points in King George County to boost economics in the county itself. So bringing people to where they would buy food, buy lunch when they come to visit King George County, or might stop and buy goods at a local shop. And so when Nick approached me, he said, all right, we have this idea for this trail. And so the first thing I said to him, and he agreed with me right away, is we can't continue down this path until we have reached out to our tribal stakeholders. And I said, we have to have full buy-in from tribal leadership of the Potomac and of the Rappahannock. And he said, yes, of course. He, you know, one of the reasons he reached out to me was because I have worked with both of these groups before in the past, and I have a relationship with the tribal leadership. And so the first thing we did is Nick and I sat down and met with both groups, with tribal leadership from the Potomac and from the Rappahannock, and we got buy-in, and we got you know, and they were so excited. Both leadership from both groups were very excited for this project as well, and they would become just such great supporters and allies and great help throughout this whole project. And so then once we had buy-in from our tribal stakeholders, and really the point was, we're going to be telling their stories. We need to make sure they are okay with us telling these stories. And so we did that. And then after that, Nick and I started talking about, all right, well, what narratives are we going to tell? And my thought was, well, first let's see, where should these signs go? Because the narratives will go with the location. Because I'm an archaeologist. I think a lot about landscape, and I think a lot about how people interact with the built environment and the world around us. And so I thought, well, we can't just pick random narratives and place the signs anywhere in King George County. We need to pick the places, and then the narratives will go with the locations. And so we envisioned this to be a driving trail, with the idea of bringing people to like circumnavigate the county. And probably no one would do all the entire trail all at once, although there are people who do that kind of thing. Instead, it would bring us to access points where people might then go and visit a different location nearby, and of course bring money into King George County. So he gave me this map and he said, all right, here are 14 places that we think we can put signs. Either the county owns the property, or we have relationship with the people who do own the property. Here are all of our options. And so I really thought about it, and I looked, and this is all before the semester even started, everything I'm talking about so far. And I thought, all right, so let's look. And the only thing he said is, I want an intro sign right here at the Sealston complex, because that is the first thing people will pass on the main thoroughfare into King George County, which is from Fredericksburg. So coming from Fredericksburg down Route 3, they will be passing the Sealston complex. And he said, I want people, and this is like a park, and it's got like baseball fields and stuff there. And he said, I want people to come in and that to be the start of the trail. And so we wanted an intro sign there. So then I thought, okay, where else can we go from there? I knew I had 12 students. I knew I was going to pair them off into twos. So I thought, all right, 6 signs, 1 intro, 6 signs, 6 narratives. And I looked at this and I thought, well, the people that we were going to be working with and we're going to be writing about, the Potomac and the Rappahannock. Well, let's think about who they are as a people, as a culture. And if we just kind of think about Rappahannock in Algonquin, means the place where the tide ebbs and flows, or where the water meets. And so water is a big part of their cultural identity, as is the Potomac on the Potomac River side. So we have the Potomac up here on the Potomac River, and we have the Rappahannock down here on the Rappahannock River, and King George kind of sandwiched in between these 2 rivers. And the Potomac River is a major part of the Potomac identity. Potomac means like meeting place. Has to do with the village of Potomac here, up actually in Stafford County, was this place where different groups, pre-European invasion and post-European invasion, would come together to this location. It was a trading place. Potomac also means trading center, perhaps in Algonquin. And so I thought, all right, how can we bring these concepts together in this trail, link these 2 groups that are separated by land, but in which water is a significant part of their cultural identity. And I thought, we need to start with signs along the water. And I thought that, so I narrowed it down. And then the other thing I was adamant from day one, and Nick agreed with me, and both tribal leadership from both groups were absolutely on board, of course agreed with me on this one, that we were not going to get stuck in 1607. That is a thing that a lot of organizations, when they interpret Indigenous history in Virginia, they kind of get stuck in 1607 and what John Smith saw. I did not want to do that. I wanted to bring it to modernity, to the present, because these people are still here. These communities are active and vibrant here in the region. And I wanted to make sure we told that story as well. I wanted to tell the story of before European invasion, after European invasion, and bring it up into the present. And so I had to find locations where I could tell, make sure these were places of significance to the cultures, to the people, and also places where we could tell the stories up to modernity, up to the present, bring it up to now. So we could talk about modern Indigenous culture in Virginia, not just 1607 Indigenous culture. So I narrowed it down to these 6 places around King George County. And I thought it's a good way to just kind of circumnavigate the main kind of economic thoroughfares, which was what Nick wanted in King George County, but were also places where we could tell really unique, good stories, good narratives. And so by this time, classes had started. We had narrowed it down to these 6 places. Classes start. By the way, all these maps that you see were made by Matt Bova. He graduated in May. He was a double major in preservation and geography. Quite a few of our students will double major in geography or do the GIS certificate. And I just want to plug the great stuff they're doing over there. It's amazing how great the liberal arts education allows us to do this interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary work, where skills they learn in another department can be really utilized over here, and vice versa as well. So I want to plug the great work Matt's doing, and he's gainfully employed in archaeology right now, so I'm happy with that. Okay, so we picked these 6 sites, plus the interest sign at Sealstead. And we eventually, these are eventually the signs that we will see, but we pair the students off, and I kind of gave them a couple different options of narratives that could be told at each location. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just tell you right now, I'm not going to show you any of these signs blown up all the way tonight for kind of 2 reasons. The first is I'm one of those people that will edit and edit and edit and edit until the very end. I can always find something. And so I don't, even though these look beautiful and the students did amazing, I will always find something to edit until the moment they go to the printer. But more importantly too, is number 2. And this is a kind of trail signage thing, is that this is being recorded to go online. And so I don't want this stuff online where you can just read it. This is an adage. Don't give away your trail sign online, because then why would anybody have a reason to come visit your trail, right? So I'm purposely not showing you these large enough to really read, because I want you all, when this trail goes up in the spring, I want you all to come to King George County and take the tour. But I'm giving you kind of a little sneak peek here. So we picked these locations, and I'll talk about the interest signs later, but just real briefly, the narratives that the students ended up picking, and each one of these narratives were thoroughly vetted by tribal leadership every step of the way. So the initial round of narratives, I said, all right, these are the things I think they're going to talk about at these locations, that went to tribal leadership for approval. And then the text, the narratives went for approval as well. So the first one is we want to bring more people to this Heritage Railroad Trail thing. It's an old railroad that's been turned into a walking trail. And so they want to bring more people to use this location. And so we thought we would put a sign there focusing on Indigenous trails and pathways in Virginia, but also specifically in King George County. We have good evidence, historical evidence of these paths that were named in colonial documents that are discussed that Indigenous people used across the King George, the land, eventually King George County. Those become colonial pathways and eventually become roads. So that sign talks about some of the modern roads and how they were originally native paths. And the next one is at Hopyard Landing. This area of King George County is called Dogue. And it's called Dogue because the Dogue people lived there. It was a village that at one point was located. The Dogue were they moved around a lot, but at one point the Dogue lived here. This sign is really interesting. I think the students took this and just did an amazing job with this one. The Doge show up in 17th century, 1600s documents, English documents, quite a bit, and they're often referred to and referenced as being kind of violent rogues and attacking the English, and they almost always show up in the documents as being violent in some way. Well, the students took that and they flipped the narrative, and they said, well, you know, why are the English talking about the Doge in this way? What were they trying to accomplish? We have to remember the written record is usually a lot of, especially government records, there's a reason that something's being written down. They're trying to accomplish something. And in this case, they want to take the Doge's land and they want to have an excuse to attack and kill the Doge people. And we see this constantly in the 17th century here in Virginia. And so the students take that narrative and flip it and say, well, why, you know, what is going on? The English are encroaching on the Doge. And they kind of look at the evidence of this, and it's really good. I'm really, really proud of that side. I'm proud of all of them. The next one was a narrative that the Rappahannock tribe specifically asked us to cover. And Chief Ann Richardson of the Rappahannock really wanted us to talk about this, and it's a great narrative. It's about what's called the North Bank hypothesis, which I won't get into. It's kind of a long history thing about analyzing John Smith's map. But the point is that the recent archaeological work has shown that the Rappahannock tribe Rappahannock peoples were living on both sides of the Rappahannock River and utilizing both sides of the river for different purposes. The North Bank hypothesis basically said that the Rappahannock people, when John Smith encountered them, only lived on the North Bank. And that's how he wrote it on his map. He only showed the villages on the north side of the river. Well, archaeological evidence, and more importantly, oral history evidence that led to the archaeological investigations among the Rappahannock people were like, no, we have always lived on both sides of the river. Both sides are important. And what the archaeological evidence shows is it was very seasonal, and that people were utilizing both sides of the river for different purposes. One mainly for agricultural, the North Bank, and the South Bank for other things like gathering, hunting, and it was more of a seasonal thing, but both sides were part of the same communities. So that was a really important one. The next was also a really important one, was specifically requested by the Potomac tribe, which is the Potomac watermen. And excuse me, this is really focused on the 20th century, and the Potomac watermen of the 20th century and their productions of a specific type of fishing trap called an eel pot, and it focuses on the importance of fishing and waterman activity among the Potomac in the 20th century, but taking it back to the pre-colonial era as well. And then we have an intro sign. And then the next sign up here is at Caledon State Park. In the north is focused on kind of the landscape of Caledon Forest, really taking in, if you haven't been to Caledon, it's a really pretty walk. It's a really pretty state park. And there are a lot of plants, edible plants and medicinal plants that just naturally grow there because of the topography and the environment, that specific environment at Caledon. And so that is what that is focused on, is indigenous uses of plants, not only like 400 years ago, but through the present. The next one at Fairview Beach, also on kind of the north on the Potomac side, is the Potomac creation story. This is the only known Algonquin creation story in the historical record, and it was conveyed here at near Fairview Beach in Paspatansy in the 17th century. Samuel Argall, who is an Englishman, he was up here trading. He was up here from Jamestown on the Potomac River, and he was trading with Chief Jappizal of Paspatansy. Chief Jappizal was the younger brother of the king of the Potomac, the Potomac, the Werewants of the Potomac. Chief Jappizal, through an interpreter, tells Samuel Argall the Algonquin the Potomac creation story. He says it in Algonquin. It gets translated through Henry Spellman to Argall, and it gets written down. And it's the only known account of the creation story among Algonquin-speaking peoples. And so this is about that, about the telling of the story and the interactions that were occurring there between the Potomac and the English, and about the creation story itself. It's about Ahone, who was the great hare, and how he created the world. And then finally, our last two are the interest signs, which I will talk more about in a couple minutes. Okay, so what do they have to produce? King George asked us for 2 interest signs, 6 narrative signs, and a draft marketing plan. And so that is what the students were tasked with accomplishing. And so the first thing we did, I did some lectures at the beginning of the semester about history of these 2 tribes and Virginia Indians. And then we took a field trip. This was a once a week, 3-hour block class. And so one day we got in the cars and we did the trail. We stopped at each site and we looked at where these signs were going to go, because one of the most important things about a heritage trail is that it should be embedded and immersed in the landscape. And since the rivers are such an important part of these narratives, I wanted them to go see where these trail signs were going to go. One of the things that Drew Gruber told the students is that you should read the first line of the sign, and if that line doesn't make you look up at the landscape, you've written it wrong. Your first line should be evocative of what's in front of the sign. Your sign should be directly linked to what is there. And so I wanted them to go see where these signs were going to go. So we did around the King George County loop, hit each of the locations. And I also wanted them to really think about what makes a good trail. And so they had to do a trail critique. They had to go do another trail somewhere else and think about things like, were the signs placed on the landscape in a way that drew you in? Were the narratives easily understandable? Were they connected? Were the signs connected to one another? Was it a continuous narrative from one sign to the next sign to the next sign? Did they all connect? And so I wanted them to think about what makes a good trail, but also what makes a bad trail, and let's avoid those things. And so after they did their trail critiques and they thought about what makes a good trail, at this whole time they're kind of working on their narratives and they're doing the research. So each group gets assigned a spot, a location, and a narrative. And they start off individually writing 500 words, which is not a lot actually to convey a dense amount of information. But the thing is, we eventually have to pare it down to 200 words. A sign, like history sign, should not be any more than 200 words. People do not have the attention span. This is just known to read more than 200 words. And so they have to pare this really dense information down to 200 words. And so they went through multiple rounds of revisions from me and through peer review. I thought it was really important that they all read each other's signs so that we made sure each of the signs were a cohesive part of the trail. And then they had to find one to two images. So this is a big lift, and they did it. It was amazing. And the narratives had to be, cohesive. They had to be understandable. And the other thing is, those of you who work in kind of heritage tourism museums, you know this. Exhibits have to be written at an 8th grade level. That way, everybody can read and understand the content. So we got these students who've been spending the last 4 years training to be scholars and writing scholarly. They still have to write scholarly, but they have to bring it down and not use a lot of jargon and only be in 200 words. This is a really difficult thing to do, but they did it. So once we had our narratives, our written narratives, our images, we then started having to think about how are we going to actually put the signs together? And I don't mean physically put the signs together, but I mean visually put them together. So one of the things that Pete Morolevich came in and talked to the class about was visual design principles. And the idea that we want to be cohesive. We want our signs to be evocative of the landscape in which they're placed. And we want to make sure we use accessible colors so that people who have vision impairment can see if they have color blindness. Same with the types of fonts that are used. We want to make sure we use, there's specific type of fonts that are best for accessibility. And so we talked about all this stuff, and he kind of walked us through like ratios of text to image on a sign. He's a great digital artist. If you look him up, Print Jazz, amazing stuff. So he kind of walked us through that one day. And so then the students started thinking about, okay, what are the main parts of, what are we trying to convey in these signs visually? If you didn't even read the text, what can you figure out from just visually looking at these signs? And so they started thinking, okay, well, the rivers are number one. The rivers are, the main part of this narrative, the Potomac River and the Rappahannock River. Okay, so we want to have something that is evocative of the rivers. And we started up calling, we toyed around with a couple different terms, but the thing we were really trying to convey is that King George County is really the only place kind of in this region that we could tell these stories, fully tell the stories of both groups, the Rappahannock and the Potomac, because King George County is the only place that is fully sandwiched between these two rivers in this region. Westmoreland is kind of on both sides, but it's mostly on the Potomac River. And then all the other counties in this region, which are in the territories of these tribes, are either on just the Potomac or just the Rappahannock. King George is the only place that we could tell this story. And so we started thinking, okay, the rivers are important, but the land in between the rivers is just as important. It's part of this narrative. And we have to remember these boundaries, these political boundaries that we think of today, King George County, Rappahannock County, these counties, those did not mean anything in the past. And really among many of the indigenous groups here today in Virginia, these boundaries still don't mean too much. They're living on both sides of the river, as the Rappahannock talk about. The Potomac are living in King George and in Stafford County. These political boundaries, we don't want to think about them when we're thinking about how to interpret these histories. And so we kept coming back to the river. We kept coming back to King George being sandwiched between these two rivers. And we kept thinking about why, we ended up picking these 6 places because we thought they were good places to bring in tourism. But why were they good places to bring in tourism? Each sign is really situated within its landscape. The locations of the sign were chosen because they're areas we want to bring people in. We want people to be patronizing the restaurants at Fairview Beach. Go to Tim's too. We want people to take tours of Belle Grove Plantation. One of the signs is going to go at Belle Grove. And so we started thinking, okay, why are these desirable locations? They're desirable locations today because they were desirable locations 200 years ago. They were desirable locations 400 years ago. They were desirable locations 1,000 years ago. These places that are now central to King George County's economic development, they're central today because European colonists built their settlements in these locations. And why did European colonists build their settlements in these locations? because these places were first central to the lifeways and cultures of the Potomac and the Rappahannock. So we didn't want to just focus on the river, but also the land on which these people physically lived. And so eventually the students, we wanted to have cohesive colors and imagery between all of the signs. The students decided, all right, our colors are blue for the river, green for the land, and then red and yellow, pulling red and yellow from the seals of the Potomac and the Rappahannock tribes, taking the colors from their seals. So we wanted to make sure each one of our signs had red, blue, green, and yellow. And so, and there were a couple of things that we all decided had to be on all the signs. There had to be a map in which you would direct people to where other sign locations are around the county. We don't want these signs to just be isolated by themselves. We want people to know, hey, there are other signs you can go look at. And Luca Malloy came up with this river motif that we decided should be on every single, in some form or another, on every single sign. That's our connective tissue through each one of these signs, is this river motif that Luca Malloy came up with. And so, and Luca is a great artist and graphic designer, and just really kind of threw themselves into this. And so if you look at this, you can see that it's evocative of the river, but the green kind of gives you the land in between the two rivers. And that was what we were trying to go for here. Now, these are the signs that the students developed last fall. Okay, and so these are what these signs look like in December. Now, the next thing they had to do was come up with a way to get people to come do this trail. Okay, and so they had to go do research about economic development and heritage tourism. And so the first place they really started was with the Preservation Virginia, the economic impact of heritage tourism in Virginia. And what they did is they found out that heritage tourism is a $7.5 billion industry in Virginia. It's a huge draw. We have the most Civil War battlefields anywhere in the country. We have several presidential mansions, Mount Vernon, Monticello, et cetera. We have Jamestown, we have Williamsburg. And so we get a lot of people who are interested in history coming to Virginia. So how can we tap into these people who either are local and interested in history, but also bringing them into King George County? How do we get those people to come spend some of that $7.5 billion? Now that, of course, that also accounts for jobs and employment, but how do we get people to come spend some of that money in King George County? How do we attract them here? And so the students each group had to come up with strategies for things to either get people to come into King George County or convince them to do all of the trail. These are just some examples. So one group said that they should do a scavenger hunt, like the way Fredericksburg does the itty bitty city in Fredericksburg, where you have little things you have to go find, scavenger hunt. By the way, I thought they were all just going to propose brochures, but they were like, nah, we want a different audience. We don't want just the standard audience of these heritage trails. We want to branch out. We want to bring young people into these heritage trails, but without leaving behind our traditional audience for these trails too. And so they had the scavenger hunt was one. The podcast, this was a great one. The idea being they would interview members of both tribes, and these podcasts would be available online to link the different trail signs. And so the idea is you would listen to the podcast between each sign, and it would be a cohesive narrative. And it would be from members of both the Rappahannock and the Potomac. And then this NFC one, I'll admit I don't completely understand, but it's kind of, from what I understand, it's kind of like QR codes, but use smartphones to do it. But the idea being it would launch like a website where you could do additional research into each sign. So there would be a landing page with additional research and citations for people who wanted the citations and additional images. One group said, well, we want to bring children into this and want children to have fun. So they proposed a couple of games to keep children involved, going to each of these signs. One group proposed geocaching. I know I used to do geocaching like in the early 2000s. I think it's making a comeback. And so they really, oh, by the way, the student who did the NFCs, I mean, he did his research. He had a whole business proposal. It's like packaged and ready. He's got this whole business proposal. And in fact, he gave it to Civil War Trails. And I think they're using it. They're going to use it. Like they're paying him to put these NFC stickers on their trails, and to donate money for the upkeep and maintenance of the trail. So you put this thing on it and you scan it, and then you can like Venmo money to the Civil War Trails to upkeep of the signs, because these signs are like thousands of dollars if you kind of combine it all together. Geocaching bring people to, geocaching is a big community. And then the other one was like a landing page with an online story map, interactive components of it. And I know we're getting time. I'm almost there, I promise. So at the end of the semester, they presented all of their research to our stakeholders, so tribal leadership, the Economic Development and Tourism Department of King George County. There were a lot of people there. And so they presented all of this, and if this was just a typical class, that would be it. But 2 students in the spring of 2023 did internships with King George County to finish this up. And another student did, she did an independent, or she did a URes with me, undergraduate research with me, to research how other localities around the country are implementing Native American culture trails, heritage trails. You would be surprised, 1, there are very few, and 2, she could really only find like 2 other examples in which there was direct collaboration with the descendant community. Like, this is some cutting edge stuff. People aren't doing this. So if King George like really markets this right, we could bring in some really, a really specific audience. And so Olivia Ruck and Luca Malloy interned at King George County in the spring 2023 semester. They finalized the signs. They helped write a grant proposal for marketing, and to fund the marketing and fund the production of these signs. And they attended stakeholder meetings, and I mean, they did a lot. They like dove into like, this is economic and tourism, economic development and tourism. They finalized the signs, so they are completely cohesive in a real meaningful way. And King George County decided that they wanted their colors to be integrated into these signs. So it's very clear that these are King George County signs. So their colors are yellow and blue. And so and I think it still works beautifully. Yellow and blue, still evocative of the landscape, and they kept the river logo there. Sam Melvin was the one who did the research project looking at how other localities are doing these trails. She wrote a wonderful conference paper, and I'm trying to convince her that it's good enough to publish, but Sam is a perfectionist, so I'm still working on her. But hopefully we get that published here soon, because I think this is a really an important project, an important initiative, and I think a good example for other localities to use. So these are the final narrative signs. And last I heard, the grant has been submitted. Hopefully funding will be coming through. The marketing strategies that they decided on were geocaching to bring people in, the podcasts to link the trails, and then the NFC to go to a landing page with a story map and additional information. So they literally they took what the students did and they're basically a final product. I read the grant and I was like, well, they took the student, they took what the students did, and it's great. And Luca and Libby, I could see their hands in that work. And so I'm really proud of all the work the students did. And one of the things we hope is that after touring this trail, people will walk or drive away, knowing about the rich and deep history of the indigenous people of this region, but also that these Virginia Indian tribes, these native Virginia tribes, the Commonwealth, these cultures are still alive and active and vibrant. And one of the things we really wanted to do was dispel the disappearing Indian myth in Virginia, that there are no Indians left in Virginia. I use Indian because that's the term used by the Virginia tribes. This trail does not just focus on the past, but also the present, and how the landscape is still present among these cultures. And like I said, King George County is one of the first municipalities to really do this. And I know I'm well over time. I'm sorry. If you were a student in my class, you would know this is standard for me. That's all I have.
Thank you, Dr. McMillan. We appreciate you taking the time to make your presentation this evening. And we have reached the point of time in the presentation where we will answer some questions. So, and once again, just go through the way to submit questions is use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can type that in, and then you can upvote. If you see a question that you'd like to have answered, you can upvote that, and we'll make sure to use that. So the first question for you is, do you have a map overlay of tribal lands for these two nations?
Sorry, I was muted. No, not at this time. One of the things that we have worked to do is take like the John Smith map and overlay it on modern maps. And we're not the first people to try to do this. Part of the problem is the John Smith map is not great. I mean, it was 1608, 1607, 1608. His surveying methods weren't amazing. But the other thing is trying to take 17th century boundaries and applying them today is a little difficult, because the best we have comes from an English point of view, which is kind of a misunderstanding of how tribal cultural relationships works, right? It's a very English perspective. Instead, we try to think about what the tribes themselves tell us where their boundaries are. And so that's something that is being worked on. And I would say, particularly if you look to the work, I am not doing this so much, but if you look to the work of Dr. Julie King from St. Mary's College of Maryland, she's done a lot of work on the Rappahannock Indigenous Cultural Landscape. That's what it's called, Rappahannock Indigenous Cultural Landscape. And she's done work to kind of look at archaeological evidence, historical evidence, modern oral history evidence of Rappahannock boundaries, and to look at that. It's not something I have pursued yet, but that's it's a great question and something worth pursuing. It would take a lot of time though, but certainly worth the time. It's a good question.
The next question is, what is the name of the trail?
Yeah, it's going to be called the Native American History and Culture Trail. There were a lot of debates on why we chose that name. So in Virginia, indigenous peoples in Virginia use the term Indian, but we understood that there are many people who don't understand that that is the case, and so they get upset by the term Indian. And so the kind of national use is Native American. So we decided to use that instead. And we didn't want to use heritage. We wanted to use history and culture. Heritage kind of sometimes sounds like it's past, which we thought history covered, but culture we felt like covered the present as well. So this was a debate in class, what name to use. I didn't uniformly just decide this. Like, the students went through this and decided that's what they wanted it called.
Okay. The next question from Ann is, will one of your signs be located at the Potomac Tribe's headquarters on Route 3?
Yeah, okay, so this is initiated and paid for by King George County. And so the initial signs will just be in King George County. The Potomac Tribal Center is in Stafford County. However, by the way, the students went to the Potomac Tribal Center and talked with tribal leadership. They also went to the Rappahannock Tribal Center in King and Queen County and talked with Chief Ann. And one of the things that both leadership from both tribes said is we want this expanded outside of King George. And so one of the things, like once we get this up and running, is can we expand this into maybe a broader northern neck trail, or go across the Rappahannock River, like into Caroline County, into more deeper into Rappahannock territory. So this could potentially, not only do we want to eventually fill out the center of King George County, but expand it to neighboring counties. So as of right now, no, but eventually, yes, that's the plan.
Okay, the next one is more of a comment than a question. Says, Dr. McMillan, this old alum is pleased to see your research and interest in this area and the creative application of learning techniques.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I think the more engaged we are, the more meaningful it is for our students, but also our collaborative partners. I'm a big proponent of like engaged, active learning.
The next question, when the signs are posted and the trail is open, will there be a place to ask questions?
Ooh, that's a good question. As of right now, that's not part of the plan. One of the things we were kind of hoping is maybe the podcast could kind of preemptively answer some of those questions that we think might come up through the trail. But that's a good question, and perhaps we would expand the trail into one of the museums or tourism centers in King George where people could go ask questions.
And then we have one more question about how did you get involved and start working with the two tribes?
Okay, so I first started working with the Rappahannock in 2018. I was brought in on that study I mentioned earlier, Julie King's Rappahannock Indigenous Cultural Landscape Project. And the purpose of that project was to map Indigenous sites along the Rappahannock River in partnership with the Rappahannock tribe. And I was brought in as like a sub-grantee on that project. And I brought students out the summer of 2018, and we went and just dug to try to find, surveyed to try to find Indigenous sites along the Rappahannock River. And that was my first kind of interaction with Chief Ann Richardson. And since then, I have worked with her on a couple things. And then starting in 2019, I started working with the Potomac. The Potomac are really close to Fredericksburg, and it's seems like a natural fit for our two entities. And so we started working with them, excavating some possible excavating Indigenous sites in the region. And since then, they have been a continuous partner. I've had students help design and create traveling exhibit cases for them when they go and talk to school groups. I'm currently assisting with the development of the new museum and some of the exhibits that are in there. And my students have been helpful in that as well, like through independent studies, that kind of thing, undergraduate research projects. So it's an ongoing collaborative relationship with both groups.
Okay, couple more here. Anne has an idea. So one idea would be to build a puzzle. Each stop you could collect a piece. It would be an outline that you trace and color in. It's great for kids. That would encourage you to visit all the sites. Final image could be something unique, outline of a person, animal, etc.
It's a great idea. Thank you.
And then Bill, are you aware of other Virginia higher ed institutions showing interest in the Virginia tribes?
Oh, yes, of course. We're not the first or only. No, of course. Most of the institutions are working with groups one way or another. But UVA works very closely. Some of the professors at UVA work very closely with like the Monacan. College of William and Mary works very closely with the Pamunkey and the Chickahominy and the anthropology department there, particularly thinking Martin Gallivan. It's a lot of anthropologists, but some historians as well. And I know there are other groups. I think VCU has I think it's VCU that's been doing some work on native plants and revitalization of native plant species. So we are not the first or the only. doing this.
And then one other comment, I just wanted to say, after making several historical interpretive signs for a preservation board that I am on, I know how hard it is to make these signs. So kudos to you and your students for some beautiful signs.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So at this point, it looks like we have hit 8:30, which is our end time for our Mary Talk tonight. But we do want to once again thank everyone for joining us. Dr. McMillan, thank you for taking your time and putting this together. Libby, we appreciate your efforts as a student in this class, and then continuing the legacy of service that Mary Washington students have always provided by continuing the project even after the class was over. So thank you for that, Libby. And we appreciate both of you for that. I also want to thank Mark Simpkins from our Events AV office who helped facilitate the virtual logistics of the program tonight. And once again, thanks to all of our viewers at home for joining us and being part of the conversation. This presentation has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few days. It does take a couple of days for us to process it and get it posted, but it will be there soon, and we'll definitely send out the link for you to be able to rewatch this again, as well as any of the other Mary Talks from the past. Our 7th season of Mary Talks will continue on November 16th and will feature our Director of Athletics, Patrick Catullo. Keep an eye out for more information on our next lecture in the coming weeks. We look forward to seeing you then, if not earlier. Thank you and good night.